Okay, so as I walk in front of the screen, um, I'm not going to repeat who I am, but I'm going to tell you that my second presentation is on sustainable integrated pest management, meaning integrated pest management with a little bit of a more natural slash what I do with treatment-free practices. And I'm going to go through those slides fairly quickly. I'm not going to dive into some of the pests and pathogens that are common in our hives. I'm just going to try to stick to the overarching principles of integrated pest management. And we're going to start with a definition. IPM is short for Integrated Pest Management. And basically, it's a multi-pronged science-based approach to keep honeybee colonies healthy. The goal is to really be the least intrusive possible and to use the most sustainable methods first. But in the end, it's a combination of different tactics to prevent, first monitor signs of issues, and reduce, in some cases, the impact of pests and diseases. It is often represented by a pyramid, just kind of like the food pyramid. And in that case, usually you want most of the bottom of the pyramid and less of the top. So as a good French girl, I'll tell you coffee and chocolate probably should be lower in the pyramid. But the principle is that you don't want as much of that top of the pyramid as you do of the bottom. So in the case of honeybees, it's a livestock. All livestock have integrated pest management. Even plants do that. And we're going to have 5 levels. First one, the base, the most important one is education and knowledge. So you guys being here is one of them. My exam is, for me, one of them as well. We always learn something. Cultural controls, that's going to be, we're going to go and dive into that, but mechanical, biological, and chemical. So up and down that pyramid, you want to stay at the bottom as much as you can to do prevention rather than intervention. So the more you do at the bottom of the pyramid, the less you have to worry about things. And if you don't do that, then you have to intervene a lot more to remedy issues. So let's talk about that first level, the one about education and knowledge. Really the most important. You're going to want to really know your bee biology. You really want to know your pest biology, pathogens as well, the life cycles and symptoms. You're going to want to understand environmental factors, develop strong diagnostic skills, understand the concept of integrated pest management itself, and things like stock and resistance levels, just basically your knowledge base, right? That includes also monitoring techniques and threshold and keeping records, and in some cases, for those of us who want to do treatments, the protocols and all of that. So let's look at that first level. Oops. Yes. Honeybee biology. Honeybee biology, honeybee biology. That's the most critical thing a beekeeper can learn. If you don't know your bee biology, the chances of you being successful are much lower, right? Whether you treat or not. So you have to understand all of these caste, brood cycles, roles, the superorganism concept, the colony biome and immune system, swarming, mating biology, epigenetics, good queens, seasonal dynamics, forage and weather, and as well as pheromonal communication, nutrition, food processing, immunity, all kinds of things, right? It's a lot of stuff to learn. So let's start with some of those principles that you need to understand, the various castes of the honeybees. There's the boys and the girls, the queens and the drones and the workers, and you need to know how long they live. You also need to know that the workers are usually during flows, the regular workers, but when there's a dearth, you end up with dutinous bees, which means long-lived bees. And did you know that you can have those as winter bees, but you can also have them as summer bees? When there's no more flying, no more bird rearing, they live longer. Those are called dutinous bees. What characterizes them is they have more fat bodies that allows them to sustain those periods of dearth. And that vitellogenin, those fat bodies, are part of the immune system of the colony. So if those bees that are long-lived have healthy vitellogenin, your colony is going to be that much healthier. So you also have to know the developmental times for each of the castes, like the back of your hand. I like to remember 3 days for all queens, 4 to 5, 5 to 6 for the workers, 6 to 7 for the drones. And then I calculate the end and backtrack my way to the larval, to the pupal stage. You have to understand that the superorganism is the animal. Super important. We look at the individual casts and bees, but what really characterizes colonies is that it's a superorganism, and as an animal, it has a gut microbiome and an immune system. It's an entire animal, and it will have. If you interfere with that, you can interfere with digestion, production of nutrients, detoxification, protection against pathogens, and regulation of the immune system. You also need to understand that the colony, the animal itself, throughout the entire season goes through different cycles and ups and downs, expansion with the nectar flows, contractions with the dearth, when they happen in your area, and how they repeat every year, more or less. So you also need to understand, and when you have pests, especially, usually the complete eradication of those pests is almost impossible, and that's okay, because the bees should be able to sustain some of that pressure if they're otherwise healthy. But every time we put something in the colonies, foreign substances, we might interfere with that symbiotic microbial and yeast relationships, that gut microbiome, and like we talked about in that previous presentation. You also need to understand temporal polytheism and how the bees change roles and functions over time, and what kind of roles and functions they have, because all of that matters. Again, foreign substances, be mindful of the unintended consequences. You need to understand haplodiploidy and how you have boys are not, eggs not fertilized and girls are fertilized. You need to understand that and really understand swarming and mating genetics, and that's very important. You need to understand epigenetics and how each of those castes are fed different jellies. There's drone jelly, there's worker jelly, and there's queen jelly, and they're all different in different quantities, in different compositions, right, in amounts. So you need to understand that by changing the diet of a less than 3 days old larvae, you can change the course of that worker and turn it into a queen if needed. Bees can do that through emergency queen cells, and we can do that also for grafting. Super important. Understand the composition and what it's for each of the castes. You need to understand basically genetics of the honeybees. It's a completely different animal than a dog or a cow. I love when people compare a dog and a cow to a colony of honeybees that's got hyper polyandry, that's open mated in drone congregation areas. It's hard to control any of those genetics and to select for anything because of it, right? But what really matters is that when you have fewer drones or poor genetics, you have inbreeding depression, which leads to issues. What you really want is a hybrid vigor. The more drones they mate with of different genetics, the more tools they have in their toolbox, meaning they have more adaptability. They have cohorts of sisters that can better do different kinds of jobs and get engaged when the need arises, whereas the opposite is not true. So you have to understand the drones and their role in the colony reproduction. So colony reproduction is not the queen laying eggs. It's first the drone reproduction and then the queen level of the reproduction. So you have Julia Mahood and Dodi did a lot of work on the drone congregation areas, right? And it's very important to understand how that works, as well as how the drones are really the flying testes in the vessel to carry the genetics from a colony to mate with another queen. That's how they propagate, they cast their genetics into the wild, right? The inbreeding depression we were talking about sometimes leads to diploid drones, and that leads to some of those spotty bird patterns. That's not always the mites. And so you got to understand this principle as well. The queen and the swarming is the other way, swarming itself is the other way the colony reproduces. So first through drones and also through swarming, where you have colony fission and a queen, the mother queen, the existing one, is sent off with a bunch of bees, leaving the daughter queens to inherit the nest. And so you have a multiplication of the colonies that way. All organisms strive to reproduce. They don't strive to collect honey for beekeepers. They don't strive to be gentle. They don't strive for any of that. All they want is cast their genetics and reproduce. So you have to understand the principles of that. Where's my, is it, which computer? Oh, that's this one. So just like the drones were the flying testes, the queen is the flying ovaries, but she's also the sperm bank. So it's very important she's good quality so that she can store a whole bunch of sperm from different drones into her spermatheca to be well bred, to have that hybrid vigor, and to make that sperm last for much longer, right? So also you need to understand that what it takes to know that your colony is queen right. You need to see signs of her. You don't need to look and hunt for her. Queen cells, you need to know which kind of queen cells are which. There's 3 kinds. Swarm cells that we just talked about when they're going through reproduction. If they lose their queen for any reason and they're still 3 days old larvae, they can make through epigenetics emergency queen cell that can sometimes be as good quality of the swarm cells. There's no better quality than the swarm cells than typically in the right conditions. And then if they're finding that the queen is waning or has an issue, they might replace her through supersedure. You need to understand that. You need to understand laying workers, failing, and poor mated queen signs. The brood pattern is going to tell you a whole lot about it. You need to understand queen pheromones. And again, I'm inviting you to go and study all this stuff. I'm not here to teach you all this stuff. You need to understand that it basically it's the glue that gets the whole animal together, and it informs a lot of mechanisms of the colony. In not only the queen pheromones, but also the worker pheromones and also the brood pheromones. All that has a role to play. Temporal polytheism, the change of jobs throughout time. You need to understand, cleaners, nurses, waxworker, undertakers, guard bees, foragers, when that happens. So you need to realize that the first 3 weeks of their lives, typically they're in-house bees and they do all the house duties, and they graduate from nursing the older larvae, first cleaning the cells, nursing the older larvae, and as they get better at this, they'll nurse the younger larvae and the queen, and then as they graduate and their glands dry off, they'll go move on to the production of wax, all that stuff, right? That's what gives them that behavioral plasticity. And by the way, it's not uniform. It's not from A to Z. It can move. Some of them might stay in the same role for a while. It's not black and white. What's important to know is that a lot of bees are usually inactive. So we don't talk about that very much. But what that does is that gives them plasticity because they're right there waiting to be engaged. If you don't have idle bees, you have a colony that's stretched out thin to do all the duties, right? So you want those idle bees. There's some info on that if you want. I can share the slides later. So to learn about bee biology, I encourage you to read these books and more. The Biology of the Honeybee by Winston, and The Buzz About the Bees, which looks at more the superorganism concept as a holistic way at the animal. Now let's look into the pests and diseases. And these 2 books are really good ones, but there's more as well. So you have to know bee biology, but pest biology, their life cycles and their symptoms, right? So we're going to look only at a few examples. But one of the things you need to know is the difference between a healthy bird pattern and a bird pattern that doesn't look perfect, and what could be causing this, right? So that you can identify signs of issues. You need to read the comb. You need to have a good understanding of what you're looking at. For example, these look fairly similar. You have uncapped pupae, but one of them is in a line, ball brood. That's probably because of wax moths tunneling in the midrib of the comb. And the other one looks more like, scatter pattern. It's more of a hygienic sign, right? Maybe there's something there, the sign of hygienic behavior. Varroa mites, one of our biggest examples, obviously, that's a scourge of beekeeping worldwide. They rely on the brood to reproduce, and especially the cat's brood. So you have to understand all that. You have to know what they look like when they're in dispersal phase. It's not called phoretic, it's called dispersal phase on the back of the honeybees, and what potentially the impact of them transferring viruses, what could be the signs, and how their expansion after the colony has expanded and starts contracting can cause economic injury and crash of the colony if that threshold gets crossed. So again, the key is the brood. In my case, as a treatment-free beekeeper, that's super important to understand this because it's going to inform a lot of the decisions I make, like not feeding pollen substitutes. You need to understand the signs of parasitic mite syndrome and how you have all kinds of spotty brood pattern and disease-looking bees. It's not the same thing as the European foul brood. You need to understand which one is which. I consider Varroa mites a secondary pest just the same as small hive beetles and wax moths. Why? Because it's a symptom of an underlying issue. It's basically mainly queen genetics or poorly mated queens, inbreeding depressions, all kinds of things. Something is not right. And that's when the Varroa mites can take over. So limited genetic diversity, poor resistance, the stock that's not resistant, or poor mating can create workers that are less capable of mite suppression in the colony. And that means it then becomes more susceptible to mite buildup and that the mites reach the economic injury threshold. So my ways to keep resilient bees that manage Varroa as a background parasite, and I want fit colonies that are not mite susceptible and that can tolerate high mite potentially populations thanks to things like suppressed virus replication, grooming, strong immune systems, and some untreated colonies will survive with high Varroa levels because the viruses are controlled. It's not so much the mite, but the viruses that they transfer that causes economic injury. So that's why I'm saying that Varroa is more like it behaves more like a secondary pest. The mechanisms of colony fitness are fairly well investigated these days. In blue, you have tolerance, meaning again, having a population that doesn't cause issues, and resistance, meaning the colony decreases the level of the pest, right? So if you look, there's a beekeeper intervention through colony size and colony dynamics that can help, but mostly the environment will have a role, as well as the adult bees through grooming, Varroa-sensitive hygiene, recapping, and cell size. That's some of the resistance mechanisms, as well as self-medication and tolerance to pathogens. The colony itself, through its swarming patterns or behavior and its colony size preferences, will also keep some level of resistance and keep the population at bay that way. And the brood itself will have an influence on the mite population through suppressed mite reproduction, post-capping duration, shorter, typically, social apoptosis, death of the pupae to kind of get cleaned out at that point will eliminate some of the pressure, and lower attractiveness to the mites will also decrease their reproduction. The tolerance paths from broods will be a higher tolerance to pathogens and a low susceptibility to get impacted. And even at the Varroa level, fecundity, virulence, and viral titers can influence those that colony fitness. So there's a lot of things going on, but typically what you'll see is a colony that's really healthy with really good stock that's resilient and a well-mated queen, and it's above the vitality threshold through good nutrition and environment, will tend to do fairly well even in the presence of mites. Very sensitive hygiene, understand the signs. When you see this, this is not a bad thing. That means the bees are taking care of cleaning up or checking out and interrupting mite cycles. Uncapping, recapping is another mechanism where you see some of those cells have like divots and different colors in the cells. That's a mechanism that the bees use as well to interrupt the mite cycle reproduction. So when it comes to mites, I hear all the time, if you don't treat your bees, they will die. Dr. Jamie Ellis, very famous beekeeper, researcher, and Dr. Megan Malbrand said, your bees don't have to die, meaning you don't have to be cruel to your bees. You can, help them out. There's a lot of emotional baggage onto those statements, right? The thing is, though, when I first started, my first colony was a package of bees. I didn't know anything. And I put it in the warrior hive, and it lasted 8 years without feeding, without inspections, and without treatment. So the bees, depending on what kind of genetics and what kind of conditions they're in, can take care of themselves, right? So the problem is that not all bees are created equal. And if you get Italian treated stock, especially from out of state, You have basically stock that's mite susceptible. I call that unfit stock that typically needs a lot of feeding. And because it needs a lot of feeding, it grows a lot of mites. And so you end up on a treat, feed, and repeat kind of cycle. If you want to go with the natural way to do integrated pest management, I recommend instead locally adapted survivor stock, right? It's adapted to the local cycles of weather and forage, and it's more resistant and typically more tolerant as well. It's a survivor means that it goes from one season to the other without, any help from us, and it thrives and reproduces. That's what survivor stock is. So TF beekeeping specifically will use that kind of locally adapted survivor stock. So start with that if you want to go down that path. If you get, if you can catch swarms, you can do splits. If you want to buy something to get started, which is what I initially did, you can get treatment-free stock from a reputable treatment-free supplier. There's some in Texas. I'm not going to name them. Or you can go with certified Russian stock, not hybrids, but certified Russian stock. While it might not be treatment-free, it tends to be a whole lot more resistant and tolerant, more resilient. And then if you cannot find any of this, you could start with susceptible stock and let them requeen themselves. And in the process, those daughter queens will go mate in drone congregation areas. Those unfit genetics will get diluted, and you're going to introduce a lot more resistance and tolerance into your daughter colonies. And then you have a backup. If you do that, if you let them swarm, you're losing the swarm, potentially angering your neighbors. But if you do a split on swarming conditions, then you can keep a backup for yourself, which also helps out. And then you can also purchase or use resistant stock from selective breeding programs. My issue with some of that is that they're grafted, which means they're using epigenetics. Those are older workers that haven't been fed royal jelly from the start, and they tend to be a little bit smaller and maybe not as good quality as swarm cell queens, right? So just kind of keep that in mind. Catching swarms, doing cutouts, doing splits, and letting the daughter colonies requeen themselves, or potentially taking a colony that has, unfit genetics and buying a queen and swapping it out. Those are the ways that you can introduce treatment-free practices. There's a list on my website, by the way, of suppliers in the United States. American foul brood, you have to understand the signs, and mostly the best interventions is to prevent through good resilient stock, good nutrition, and just kind of sanitary intervention. And also you can avoid sharing comb that might be contaminating, feeding honey that might be contaminated, especially grocery store honey. Cycling out all comb will help. There's all kinds of things that you can help with. If you buy equipment, you can bleach it out with a solution, diluted solution. You could do all kinds of things, but just try to follow good practices and prevent the issue from happening in the first place. If you have an outbreak, just kind of try, there's several things you can do. Just kind of make sure that colony is strong and well fed, good nutrition. And also you could, in early stages, you could shake all the bees onto brand new equipment, a brand new comb, because the disease is in the brood. So you're going to leave a whole lot of that back. If the colony is well advanced into American foul brood, then you might just get rid of the colony altogether. Requeening in the early stages is also one way you can try to cycle out those genetics. European foul brood, so it's also a foul brood, but European is not as bad as American. Anyway, so the thing is that this one is a nutritional stress linked. So you have an imbalance of nurse bees to brood, and they can't keep up. In the spring, usually when there's an explosion of brood, and those glutinous long-lived bees are starting to die because they're foraging, and so they can't keep up with feeding. So you have nutritional stress, and you see signs of disease larvae, they're dying. So whereas American foul brood, they die closer to pupation under the capping, with European foul brood, because it's nutritional, it happens a lot earlier, so it's more visible. But some of the interventions is you can basically wait for the nectar flow to kick in. that'll help flush out some of this. Or you can feed sugar syrup, or you can add nurse bees to reestablish that ratio. And you can also compress. So a lot of time compressing colonies into much smaller quarters really helps them feel better and take care of brood and issues. And if really it's chronic, so usually it's a seasonal thing, right? In the spring or at the onset or at the outset of a dearth, you see some of that potentially. It flushes itself out. But if it's chronic, it might be linked to the genetics of the queen. So you might consider requeening and getting rid of that unfit genetics. So small hive beetles. So the whole thing about prevention is usually to understand the biology of the pests or pathogens so that you can prevent it or interrupt it before it gets too bad, right? So small hive beetles, you can cut that going into the hives or not having as many places to hide, and then preventing them from pupating in the ground. So things like keeping strong colonies, dry ground, landscape sand that makes it hard for them to pupate into the ground is going to help. Top bar hives that have very few hiding places actually will do better with small hive beetles than frame-based colonies that have a lot of nooks and crannies where they can hide, inner covers, things like that. Wax moths, similar. Prevention is the best. So understand the symptoms, realize they prefer dark, uncovered, unprotected comb. So again, strong colonies, and cull your comb, your old comb out to keep fresh, so it's less attractive to them. So that was your education and knowledge. There's a lot to learn. I'm not going to go into all those details. The second level is going to be your cultural control, and we've touched upon that a little bit already. You're going to want to make sure you have good queens, locally adapted survival stock, and all the things that I mentioned earlier. Well-fed queens, swarm conditions or potentially supersedious conditions are great. That means they're going to be better mated, and also when we graft queens, we tend to harvest them as soon as we know they're mated. They need some time to establish their reproductive, mechanism. So letting them establish will make for better queens, locally adapted. So just don't get those Hawaiian queens, probably not going to make it. Those Michigan queens are not going to do well in Texas, and vice versa. Keep strong colonies. So one of the things you can do to improve your stock is cull out the weak and propagate from the strong that are taking care of themselves. Minimize stress, nutrition inspections, the beekeepers the worst. And then minimize competition, robbing, spacing. Avoid increasing pest pressure by not forcing brood through dearth, for example, and by removing unprotected combs. Practice sanitation, consider immunity of the colonies, and natural comb is a big tool for me to keep my bees very healthy. By the way, natural comb, we have talked about the potential issues with foundation. First, beeswax foundation is contaminated with a lot of pesticides, miticides applied by beekeepers, but also it has usually a larger size cells, whereas the colonies tend to utilize a whole wide range of different sizes for optimal efficiency in their nest. With honey at the top, and all this, the nest for workers, having workers and drones. You don't see that when you're using foundation, by the way, but it also improves when natural comb improves vibrational qualities of the comb, so for communication, dances, and it also improves clustering efficiency when the colony can transfer the heat through natural wax and can communicate between combs a lot bit more easily. And then also, because the cells tend to be smaller in the bird's nest, it tends to decrease post-capping duration, which means it leaves less time for the mites to cast daughters. Cut out unsanitary old wax for pathogen buildup and chemical buildup, and improving their immune systems, and also fewer pests and pathogens because they prefer a lot of that older comb. And it improves with the brood viability and mite tolerance because they're healthier. Propolis, immune system, gut microbiome. It's also their pharmacy, basically. So it's very important to encourage that. And try to not go over carrying capacity and not have too many colonies in one place. If you want to help your bees, nutrition. Planting for bees is super important. Good forage makes for successful beekeeping, basically. Healthy bees will have a lot of food. So speaking of that, we talked about earlier about the cards and the protein substitutes and how it can increase broods and have unintended consequences with pest loads and especially mites, as well as a host of other issues. So I encourage you to kind of potentially reconsider your influx of soft sugar breaks and pollen substitutes, which, by the way, are not necessarily digestible as is by the bees. It's not because they look like they're consuming it that they're actually getting anything out of it, and it can create issues, as we saw earlier. And also, mostly, you don't want to force brood through a dearth because it's stressful, but also it raises more mite. There's no mite break if there's no brood break, right? So kind of respecting those natural brood breaks. I'm not saying forcing brood breaks. I'm saying respecting natural brood breaks. Stressors can be linked to vertical management stressors where you're cracking open the entire animal, crushing some bees, having to get the bees a little bit more defensive. Also the chimney effect and how the brood's nest is trying to stay a little bit warmer, but the heat is lost to the stack, which is why, again, I like my horizontal tabar hives a little bit better because it's less stressful for the colonies. And it's also easier on the beekeepers, and we talked about that earlier. So I call that better beekeeping for the bees and the beekeepers back in budget, and I would add brains because it's a lot easier to see how it does. Now, a lot of beekeeping, the beekeeping industry is focused on commercial beekeepers because they have the most amount of hives. However, 90%, 95% of us are not commercial beekeepers, and only less than 1% is migratory beekeepers. So we have other choices, and we can do things a little bit differently. And so that's something that you can consider doing, trying other hive styles that minimize stress for the bees. Okay, so that was for the cultural controls overall. The next level is going to be your mechanical interventions in integrated pest management, things that prevent or trap pests to minimize their base population, prevention again. So good equipment, rough cut wood helps with propolis use, smaller entrances that are easier to defend and decrease robbing, and also drafts. Thermal mass and installation is also very helpful to maintain homeostasis because it absorbs the variations of temperatures. Anything that's in green are the things that I do in my treatment-free operation. You can also use barriers, like we were talking about the sand for the small hive beetles. I do not do those, but they're part of integrated pest management strategies that are available. Mechanical traps, powder sugar applications, drone trapping and culling, queen caging, and screen bottom boards because they're all, to me, treatments. So let's talk about treatments and what it actually is. It's any intervention that has the intention of controlling a pest population or decreasing that pest population or the diseases, basically. And that includes chemical and non-chemical interventions. So basically, directly affecting the pest population. It's applied by the beekeeper externally, and the goal is to decrease that population to keep susceptible genetics that would otherwise die alive, right? The synthetic chemicals, soft chemicals like essential oils and organic acids, and biotechnical treatments, all of those are examples of treatments. Just keep in mind that everything is a trade-off. Nothing is free when we're playing with a superorganism. What's important to remember is we're all on a spectrum. So we have on each end, there's a cost. Everywhere you are on that spectrum, there's a cost to our interventions. So let's start with, for example, if you're on the one end of completely strict natural selection, black box, live and let die, bond method, Dr. Kifus, just let nature do the selection because it will. Colonies will eventually, will initially crash, but then the survivors will rebound with tolerance and resistance, and the bees will take care of themselves. That's what they've done for millions of years. Not everybody wants to do this. I started my quest with treatment-free, where I was using stock that was, resilient, known to be already selected, not necessarily by nature. Some of it, yes, but some of it by people that had done selective breeding. And I use locally adapted survival stock as one strategy. The next level would be biotechnical treatments, meaning mechanical interventions like queen caging, drone removal, sugar dusting, and pest traps. Those are treatments per what we defined. Organic chemical treatments, like the organic acids and the essential oils. And then in the end of the spectrum, you have synthetic chemical and treatments. So at the end of the spectrum, you are basically keeping alive unfed genetics, might susceptible in this case, genetics. And on the other side, you're doing selection and propagating locally adapted survivor stock. The one side on the left is going to be based on confidence in natural selection and the strength of and resiliency of the bees, and independence from any treatments, right? The more you're on that side, the less you're doing to treat your colonies, and you're keeping bees that are generally fit, that are taking care of themselves. On the other side, you're really worried that your bees might die, so you really want to help them out, and that comes from a good place. So, but there's a little bit of fear involved, and now you're dependent on treatments and interventions because your colonies are less fit. They're more susceptible to the pests and pathogens. So decide where you are in that spectrum. We're all different, and by the way, where you are today might change compared to tomorrow, but just know that in all cases, whether you're on one end to the other, it comes with a trade-off. Everything has a cost. So we're all on the spectrum. When it comes to natural treatment-free beekeeping, basically I leverage natural selection. My goal is to strengthen the gene pool. So I'm looking at selection not just at individual colony levels, but at a more genetic pool in the area, the species. And the goal is to select for resilient bees and less virulent mites, basically. The goal is to build long-term sustainability so we don't have to intervene as much, and independence from treatments. And the goal is to cut down costs long-term, economic and time. So there's a lot of examples in the world these days where natural selection has done its work. African bees, Cuban bees, Jamaican bees, Puerto Rican bees. I'm not going to go into the details, but you're saying African bees, well, they have some advantages. They tend to be more adapted to that kind of beekeeping. But that's true also in Europe, in France, in the Arno forest in the US, in Sweden, in England. There's a lot more examples where bees have gone through natural selection and are starting to be more resilient naturally. And in Australia, we're looking at some of those examples as well. I'm not going to get into the details. I just came back from 3 weeks in Australia discussing all that. So what are the implications? Well, what are the long-term costs? So you can either go with natural selection or treatment-free and go through short-term losses initially, like in Australia. The wild bees are going to crash initially, and then they'll rebound, right? So the long-term gains, they're going to have strong, resilient bees left over. If a lot of beekeepers are going to go with a treatment path, well, they're going to keep alive unfit genetics, mite susceptible genetics, and it's going to delay natural adaptations, natural selection. So basically, you're going to have a pay the bill now, and yes, it hurts, but then it's done. Rip up the Band-Aid. Or you can choose the path of, well, I'm just going to go little by little, but it's going to last forever. In the US, we've been on a treatment cycle for over 30, almost 40 years now, right? So in the end, all those treatments in that time and all of that is costing money. So there's a cost associated to everything, right? I'm not just saying that out of nowhere. I spent the best part of 2019. I was hired by the Congolese government to design and lead their beekeeping training program. So I spent most of the year there writing manuals and setting up teaching apiaries. For those of you who don't know where that is, that's next to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I traveled north and south, east and west with armed guards and set up those teaching apiaries, again with horizontal tabahas. But what I can tell you is that they had bees everywhere. I did cutouts that caught swarms, and there were bees everywhere without treatments, right? They had gone through that initial crash and rebounded and were thriving. Let's talk about mechanical barriers and traps. So that was the genetic part of it. Mechanical barriers and traps. You can have screen bottom boards, mite beetle traps, Swiffer sheets. Those are traps. They're considered treatments because they are intervening on the pest population directly, or you can use entrance reducers. So there's all kinds. And then the other thing you can use for mechanical barriers is robbing screens. Mechanical powder sugar treatments. Yeah, those bees might not make it, by the way. It's not because they're going back in the hives that they might make it. And the brood also has breathing spiracles. So there's a cost associated. So you're going to have a loss of bees and you're going to have a loss of brood potentially. So just I'm trying to bring to your attention this the theme of my presentations is unintended consequences and costs, right? Same thing with drone trapping and culling. If everybody traps their drones and culls them out, what are the queens going to mate with in the area, right? And what kind of selective selection are we going to see some inbreeding depressions because of it? Same thing with queen caging and forced brood breaks. That's also a treatment. So you're trying to intervene so that the colonies that are not fit can survive and get to see another day. Talked about insulation. That obviously helps with thermal mass and lower stress. So beyond the physical and mechanical level, let's talk about, this is where I usually stop. If I've done everything else that I've talked about the green side, I've done my prevention. I'm done. I don't need to intervene usually, right? But there's another step that we could take is biological. So things like nematodes, predators, califers, parasitoids, pathogens, BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, pseudoscorpion, all this stuff, even entomopathogenic fungi, microbes. There's all kinds of it's biological intervention. It's really hard to apply. It's not necessarily sustainable. It's not very well researched, and it has to be reapplied usually. But if you've done everything else, you don't really need to get there. The next step is going to be your chemical interventions with your soft chemicals, the essential oils, as well as the organic acids. Organic doesn't mean innocuous, it's caustic. And then the synthetic chemicals, as well as potentially antibiotics, which we're doing less and less these days. Most of them have interesting application methods. And so just kind of make sure if you're using especially organic acids that you really cover your skin, your eyes, and protect your lungs. The point though is that if you have to get to this level, you're interfering with, it's interfering with natural selection. It's eliminating the selective pressure on the pests and on the bees, and it's putting it on the pests instead. So they suppress symptoms, but not the underlying causes, and they dilute the genetic pool with unfit genetics. So in the end, they select for miticide-dependent bees and more virulent mites in this case. So everything, again, has a cost, right? So there's an impact to everything. So I'm not going to go through what to keep in mind because I don't want to repeat myself. I want to bring your attention to the Tools for Varroa Management, the Honeybee Health Coalition, the 7th edition. They had a line for a while on overwintering colony loss, where the efficacy of treatments was up to 41%. And then the next best thing was requeening. I mean, the better thing was requeening using resilient stock. So they were about the same level of overwintering success. But the line was also saying the locally adapted survivor stock could bring that to 92% success. So basically, what I want you to keep in mind is that treatments interrupt natural selection and the onset of resistance. It delays the onset of resistance and tolerance. They select for stronger mites and unfit bees, and allowing selective pressures to be put on the bees selects for stronger bees. I know it's scary, but it's something to keep in mind and for you to decide where on that spectrum you want to be. And treatments keep bees on the miticide treadmill. Again, you just have to keep in mind that circumstances are different for migratory pollinators. They might not be able to do natural treatment-free beekeeping because of the constraints and conditions they're in and the kind of stock that they're keeping, whereas 95, 99% of us that are not migratory pollinators, commercial beekeepers, we have other choices. And there's a couple of books that have been out, in particular the Honeybee Solution to Varroa by Dr. Stephen Riley in the UK. I really encourage you to read that because it's basically a crowdsourcing selective breeding that allows the onset of more resilient genetics through collaboration. I really think that's a great way to do this, like selective breeding pods. One little thing, that's my that's my thing. Who benefits when you keep treating? Well, I mean, the global mite treatment industry is worth millions. Basically, dependence means more sales, right? Research is often funded or influenced by chemical. I know this is a little controversial, but I think it's important to keep those things in mind. And what I want to consider as well is that very often when there's any research done, it's looking at the LD50, the lethal dose at 50%, which usually is done in laboratory conditions and it looks at at a acute impact right now. It doesn't look at a chronic impact later down the road. And in what other livestock industries are we saying it's okay to kill 50% of your livestock so that the treatment is adequate? Again, that cycle of dependency, you want to keep that in mind. And I think that coming back from Apimondia, I've noticed there was a lot more talk about selecting for Varroa resistance and that being an actual valid option, a conversation that was not heard of 2 years ago and now is very much at the forefront of discussions across the world. So people are moving away from synthetic chemical treatments and they're looking at much more sustainable practices because it helps everything moving forward. Now, one caveat is that we have new pests coming in, and we might actually restart the clock on Tropilelaps, for example, and maybe we can learn from some of our past experiences with Varroa mites and see if we can do things a little bit differently moving forward. Anyway, the question was to talk about integrated pest management. There's a whole lot more that can be talked about that, but you wanted me to talk about treatment-free and some of my techniques and reasoning behind this. So hopefully that was useful to everybody. We might not be on the same spot in the spectrum, and that's okay, to each their own, but I wanted to share some of my tools to get to that other end of the spectrum today. So with that, do you guys have any questions on this presentation? Yes. Thank you. Yes. I'm going to go back first, and then I'll come back to you. Miss Angela.
In the world of just Varroa and not Tropilelaps yet, how long do you think it would take all hobby beekeepers to all have survivor stock if we all stop treating?
Well, so I don't know if everybody's going to want to do that. If we did want to do that, it depends on location, starting genetics, density of colonies in the wild. Like, for example, I'll give you an example. In Australia, so in most countries where bees were left to their own devices without even management from beekeepers, the initial crash happened within a year or two, and then it took about 6 to 8 years for rebounding of the wild colonies, right? In Australia, they have some of the highest densities of wild genetics, and they have mild climate, and they have a whole lot of forage, so perfect conditions for bees. And when I went and spoke over there at the Natural Beekeeping Summit and looking at the research that was out there, my guess was that it would take them about 3 years to go through that cycles. Now, it's obviously going to be delayed. The more you have people that treat, the more delayed that process is, and vice versa. So my favorite answer in beekeeping is it depends. And I'm sure it's a lot of you's favorite answer as well. Okay, other question? Thank you, Angela.
Yeah, what are your views on hive splits versus swarm traps? I mean,
in terms of,
well, if you split your hives,
so
mechanical intervention.
So if you split your hives for the purpose of outrunning the mites, that becomes a treatment, obviously. I don't, typically I'm too busy. I can't keep up with them. And my bees that are not treated tend to explode and swarm on me before I can get to them. At that point, it's not a bad thing. It's a cleansing cycle. They get fresh genetics, more, locally adapted. They mate with drones, and the mite cycle is interrupted. So it's always a good thing when they swarm for me, right? If I get there and monitor and get them before the swarm leaves with the mother queen and a bunch of the bees, then I get to preemptively harvest the split. But I like to do it on swarming conditions. Best is when you have swarm cells and the mother queen hasn't left, and then you could do a split. But that's more because I don't want to lose those bees. It's not done for the purpose of the bees would do it anyway. And if I see they're getting congested and they're getting near that, but I won't be able to come back before the swarm happens, right? You should go every 5 days to check for the swarm cells. And if I can't, then I'm going to potentially read my colony in that congestion. Lots of bees, congestion in the capped brood, lots of capped brood, drones, lots of food coming in. It's just getting fat and tight in their quarters, too big for their britches. Then I might take a preemptive split, but on the swarming conditions. And then I'll find that queen and I'll try to mimic as best as possible the swarming conditions. And I'll take her away with a comb or 2, maybe 3, depending on what I've got, and put it as a backup colony and then let them remake another queen at that point. They will go, just like if they would on a swarm, through a brood break. That's going to help with the mite cycles, but I'm not doing that for that purpose. If I did, that would be a treatment. Does it answer your question?
Yes. Do you use swarm traps? So, I mean,
I do use swarm traps when I have time. I have 400 colonies, and it's just me and my helper, and it's in different yards, about 40 of them, and I do a lot of other things than just the management of my bees. So I have a hard time keeping up with all of them, let alone set up swarm traps to catch swarms. So I could, but I have, and so my husband just told me we were looking into the pole barn next to our detached garage, and there's a blue Lowe's bucket that's broken, sitting under that pole barn. Then he showed me a picture. And it's like there's bees going in and out. So I catch swarms unintentionally, and then I love to use them as demos for my apprenticeships and workshops to show people how to potentially transfer them from an inadequate cavity to something that I can manage and maybe give them better conditions as a demo on how to do a cutout, basically.
thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. Doing swarm trapping is great because it can you have a higher chance of getting locally adapted survivor stock when you catch swarms. Yeah, you might run into conventional genetics that are Italians or something, or treated genetics, and that's okay. You just let them kind of show you what they're going to do, and then potentially let them requeen themselves or whatnot. But you have a much higher chance, because there's more bees in the wild than they are managed, to have locally adapted survivor stock when you catch swarms. So that's a great way to try to diversify your apiary.
How does the Demery method fit into all your?
The Demery method is mostly for Langstroth. I could do Demery method. I don't have time for this. I do beekeeping simple. I think the Demery method, you're basically doing, it's a one way to do a split. And from that standpoint, at some point you have a brood break in one of the sides of the Demery method, which provides, new genetics and all of that. So it's not quite as regular splitting, but it follows some of those principles.
Would you count that as a treatment or not?
If you're doing it for the sake of cutting out the population of mites, anything you do with the intent to lower the population of mites is going to be considered a treatment. In my definition of treatments, which is there's a treatment-free group that has over 100,000 followers that I'm an admin for, and that's definitely very much so part of the definition. Is anything you do with the intention of knocking back the pest population is going to be a treatment. But leveraging bee biology and just kind of instead of forcing an agenda, just following their nature and just making things happen so you don't lose the bees, that's not a treatment. I know this is not a common territory. Hopefully I'm not shocking everybody. Joseph.
How did you fare with the colony collapse issue?
You mean the 60% average of last year? So my losses are 5 to 15% is usually my problem, or I keep bees in the hill country, and Lauren knows it's very really difficult, challenging, because there's not a whole lot of nutrition. We grow rocks, juniper, oaks, and cacti. And so the nectar flows are very difficult. But the best part of this is that whatever bees make it through are very resilient, and it makes you a better beekeeper because it's more challenging. Now, good forage makes good beekeepers out of all of us, and that's great. But the selective pressure is not on us to get better. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, so I agree that there's a lot of really great traits for mite resistance, you know, and I've seen this with commercial beekeepers too, where I give them mite biters or VSH or like selective stocks, and they see a big difference. But you kind of look at, I'm kind of a broader question. So over the past 10, 20 years, we've seen these massive colony losses, like commercial level, right? And so I know some beekeepers every couple of years they lose 80% of their colonies, and you mentioned that this kind of delays natural selection, but you would almost think that over the past 10 years that they are grafting from their survivors, even though they are treated for mites. You would think over time that there might be progress. I'm just curious, like, what your thoughts are, and even for a beekeeper, even for like a small scale beekeeper that's buying 10 colonies every single year, why aren't they seeing maybe the type of progress that you might see from your type of program?
That's a great question. So basically, anytime you treat anything, you're interfering with natural selection. You're slowing it down. So if you've got any kind of treatments, those are not survivor stocks, right? They're supported by that help, right? In the problem with the migratory, especially pollination commercial beekeepers, is that they're using a lot of mite susceptible genetics, like Italians, potentially Carniolans, and they have to be fed because they have a lot of brood, and because of that they're growing a lot of mites. So treat, feed, and repeat is kind of like the norm, right? Trying to take that kind of genetics and breed resistance out of it is very difficult, and it's kind of especially in the conditions that they're put through with the stress, the transportation, the promiscuity, and all those pollination orchards and everything, makes it really difficult and challenging for commercial beekeepers to get there. And so in smaller yards that are static, it's a little bit easier. I know that there's Randy Oliver, for example. He's got his treated yards, and then he's using some of the ones that didn't get treated to measure mite populations, and the ones that don't make the cut get treated, and the ones that make the cut get selected from in that treatment-free operation. That's one way to try. It's a lot longer than relying on locally adapted survivor stock. However, the results, the reason why commercial beekeepers also use those genetics is because they need uniformity and of behavior mostly, and how they all react the same way at the same time based on the same conditions. Locally adapted survivor stock is a hodgepodge of things. They do their thing. They have various mechanisms. It's not focused on honey production necessarily, although a lot of them do produce a lot of honey. It's not necessarily focused on gentleness, although a lot of them are very gentle. It's more for the colony survival than beekeeper selected traits. And so because of one of the things is that when we select for specific traits like honey production and gentleness and, I don't know, color, whatever, you end up selecting away from fitness traits. And so there's a trade-off. Again, there's a cost associated to everything. But yeah, the losses that we've seen last year into those operations, I didn't see that at all. And I have 400 colonies that I'm managing by myself, but they take care of themselves for the most part. The higher losses that I usually get, around 15%, is when there was really bad forage that year, or extended dearths, very stressful conditions. And maybe sometimes when a colony swarms and I didn't catch it, or even if I split on swarming conditions, the daughter queens don't come back mated or poorly mated. Those are some of the reasons why I lose colonies. I don't lose them to mites. I don't see PMS. I don't see any of that stuff. Does it make sense? Did I answer your question?
Oh, that's good. Yeah. And one really good point you made is, and this is when I talk about, like, if you want to run a breeding program, and a beekeeper may have 5 colonies, and I want to run a breeding program, but if you don't have the baseline genetics, it doesn't make any good, right? And so, like, when I screen these commercial operations with their colonies that they're choosing as their breeder colonies, like, they don't have the VSH or the grooming behavior, and so you can't breed if you don't have it there already.
Right.
And so if you're a small scale, Sometimes, I mean, depends on the genetic. I mean, depends on your area, right? Like the drones in the area, what queens you're selecting from. So you might have the genetics, you might not have the genetics. And even for a beekeeper that's 10 colonies, if you're buying, new colonies every single year from one beekeeper, they may not have the genetics that you can actually breed and select from, right? So like it's really important to have those baseline genetics, and maybe a good start is.
But if you don't have them, so for example, I tell people that are starting with susceptible genetics, Italians, let's say, treated, and they bought that because they, so the worst thing you can do is getting those genetics and not treat them, and then expect to have a good success rate. What you can do is start helping them cycle out those genetics. Maybe compact them, congest them so that they get a little swarmy, and so they can make their own queen. They can requeen themselves. Splitting on swarming conditions. Cycle out the genetics. At least you're getting now mating in the local area drones with the local area drones that have survivor genetics because they're not managed and they're just doing their thing. And so you're starting to instill and infuse a lot more resiliency in those. If you keep those genetics, you're starting from an uphill battle, but it doesn't mean it's impossible. You just want to look at the biology of the honeybee and the mating biology and genetics in a different way. You're not looking at selecting per colony. You're looking to select at the species level at this point, at the genetic pool in the area. So it kind of changes the narrative, the context.
Man's trying to lock the building.
Oh, we're running out. Okay, thank you. So that was not a question. Everybody good? Any other questions? I'm happy to. Thank you for being here today. Appreciate you guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.